Hello and welcome to Motorsport Speak, a weekly motorsport podcast brought to you by the team behind Motorsport Week and motorsportmonday.com. My name's Dan Lawrence and I'm joined by Taylor Powling, and we're here to discuss Formula 1 Australian Grand Prix. We had a different winner. It was Carlos Sainz on the top step of the podium this time, not Max Verstappen, which is a change of tune for the elite single-seater racing series. So Taylor, how are you and did you enjoy the race?
Hi Dan, I'm good, thanks. I hope you're well as well. It was, by F1 standards of the last 12 months, it was an okay race. There were a few moments, especially in the middle part, where it kind of just settled down, and dirty air seems to be quite a big topic with the 2024 cars struggling to follow each other. There were a lot of cars outside of 1 second just kind of following and maintaining pace. But yeah, a solid 6 out of 10, I'd say.
Yes, I would kind of agree with your assessment. It was sort of that flurry of excitement at the start with Verstappen's retirement. But then from there, it just sort of, as you said, it settled into sort of 2021 style, follow the leader at a distance sort of shenanigans. But should we talk about Carlos Sainz? Smooth operator, Chili, El Matador Jr., many nicknames for the Ferrari man. 2 weeks after having an appendectomy, he's benefited from the weight-saving tactic of removing his appendix and recovered well to win a Grand Prix. I thought it was a very impressive performance from him myself. He sort of controlled proceedings as soon as Verstappen had his issue with his rear brake basically exploding, it kind of looked like, when it got back to the pits. But yeah, with Verstappen out of the equation, Sainz just reeled off good, confident laps and took the checkered flag in style.
Yeah, I think this was actually probably Sainz's strongest win and one of his strongest performances in F1 in general. Ferrari looked strong all weekend. From the outset, the car looked settled. Leclerc was leading the way, the Ferrari charge, and it looked like Sainz was kind of settling back into things after his operation. But as soon as Saturday came, Leclerc struggled with the car. The balance kind of shifted, and it was Sainz that bagged the front row. Could have potentially grabbed pole. If you look at the telemetry, turns 9 and 10, Verstappen was mighty through there, but it also looked like Sainz had a bit of an error. So that 2-3 tenth gap, Sainz could have bridged. But when Verstappen and Red Bull then hit trouble in the race, once again, it was Sainz on hand to pick up the pieces. And fair enough, I think he was helped by the fact that Leclerc messed up his qualifying and was behind Norris, which triggered Ferrari to initiate an undercut as early as lap 9 on Norris, which got Leclerc ahead of the McLaren into second, but then also meant he had to do a lot of tyre saving. Kind of, Fred Vasseur said it compromised his strategy, so he wasn't really in a position like Singapore to battle against his teammate. But the most important thing for Ferrari, it was a 1-2 finish. They maximised the opportunity when Red Bull faltered, and they're now right back in the championship hunt, only 4 points behind Red Bull in the championship. Leclerc splitting the two Red Bull drivers in the Drivers' Championship. So yeah, could be all to play for. But I suspect as we go to more conventional circuits in Australia, that Red Bull will still be back on top. And it is quite ironic that the last time Red Bull were defeated in Singapore last year, the next race on the calendar was Japan. And because of the calendar change, we've got Japan as the next race. So I'm sure Verstappen will be fueled up and ready to, dominate that weekend like he did last year.
Yeah, for sure. I think, again, like what you said in your opening sort of speak was about the following and stuff like that. And I think qualifying was vital, especially with the issues with tyre graining. Everybody sort of had to settle into tyre management mode pretty much from the outset. So any mistake in qualifying was going to be costly, and that's what it proved to be for Leclerc. He obviously had to abandon his final Q3 run, and that meant the first stint trying to sort of battle the McLarens and then committing to the undercut, then compromised his second stint, and it wasn't really until the final stint of the race where everybody was sort of locked into where they were anyway, but he had good pace. I mean, I guess he'll be encouraged by the fact that he set the fastest lap. Was it at the end again, like he did in Saudi Arabia?
Obviously, it wouldn't have been the last lap because of the virtual safety car, which we'll get onto later. But yeah, it was in the closing stages, and Leclerc actually did manage a really mighty final stint. I was kind of keeping track of it. Considering how early he had to pit because of the offset strategy, he really had a strong final stint. And I think although he'll be happy that Ferrari landed a 1-2, he'll also feel like it's a missed opportunity considering how strong he was through Friday practice and how comfortable he was with the car, to then not have that same feeling in qualifying and slip behind not only both Red Bulls, his teammate, but also a McLaren. And that cost him the race because Sainz was able to, go long on the optimal strategy, whereas Leclerc had to pit as early as lap 9 just to get ahead of Norris, which paid dividends for Ferrari, but did compromise Leclerc's chance of the win. And as soon as he came out in second, it was kind of Ferrari settled into that order of like Singapore, where Sainz was the guy they had share bets on to win the race, and Leclerc was there as a kind of rear gunner to protect him out front.
Yeah, I think Ferrari are probably kind of aware of the fact that over a 24 race season, Red Bull are still going to be the clear favourites. So it's not a case of challenging for top positions in either championship, honestly. So I think once you set into a 1-2, it doesn't matter which way around it is, probably good to just leave it as is, regardless of other circumstances, because you want to make sure that you're piling up points ahead of the likes of McLaren, Aston Martin and Mercedes. And I think it's weird to see Leclerc having struggles in qualifying, because obviously that's his sort of trademark is nailing it in qualifying and doing these amazing qualifying runs. It's also interesting, obviously, that we're going to Suzuka next, like you said, how that was sort of the case last year. We had the one non-Red Bull win and then we went straight to Suzuka. And Suzuka is kind of where in 2023 Leclerc started his promising run in the tail end of the season. So it'll be interesting to see if he does that again. But I think Ferrari, maximum points haul. And it does make the championship table look quite exciting at this early stage. I'm sure Red Bull will be back, most definitely. I think Sergio Perez was under the impression that Max wouldn't have won if he hadn't had his DNF, which is basically his rear brake drum. Right rear seized, essentially. He said it was like driving with a handbrake for those first few laps until obviously it enabled Sainz to pass on the run down to turns 9 and 10 on lap. I think it was lap 2, wasn't it? Yeah, and then obviously retired shortly afterwards, and then it sort of just exploded as he entered the pit lane, caught fire. So that was Verstappen's race done. Perez thinks Verstappen wouldn't have won the race. I honestly don't believe that assessment. I think Verstappen is too good at the moment. I think that Red Bull is still the dominant car, and regardless of the tyre wear, the graining and all those other I'll just say a simpler word, all those other external circumstances or whatever, I think he would have nailed it. Obviously, Perez and Horner, apparently Christian Horner's assessment of Perez's race, which was a sort of a underwhelming 5th place, that was down to a tear-off caught in his floor. Yes, what do you think? If Max's DNF hadn't occurred, would we have had a classic fight for an Australian Grand Prix victory, or would Verstappen have sailed off into the distance, or would Sainz have controlled things still? What would be your verdict?
It's like a repeat of Azerbaijan 2022, where you've got Ferrari versus Red Bull, and because of circumstances, each team kind of says the other would have won or they would have won. It's a tough one because we didn't actually get a true gauge of Red Bull's pace. Obviously, there's a disparity between what Max and Checo can do in that RB20, but Checo's pace was hampered by the 3-place grid drop for impeding Hulkenberg in qualifying, dropped him from 3rd to 6th. And then further still, he lost a place to Russell on the opening lap of the race, which then he was stuck behind the Mercedes for a few laps, and that kind of lost the best life of his tyres. And then, as you touched on just there, Christian Horner did come out after the race and say that a visor tear off, not sure who from, but I presume it'd be Fernando Alonso because that's who he was overtaking when the issue occurred. It got lodged under his floor and caused a significant load loss in excess of 20 points. So, quite a sizable hindrance to Perez there. And it's no surprise that once he got past Alonso, he wasn't able to pull away and challenge the McLaren. So that was his race done. So we never got a gauge of Perez's true potential because either he was in traffic or his car wasn't operating to its maximum potential. Horner also said that Red Bull were able to solve the problems they had on Friday. They had high graining both on Friday and Saturday morning. Verstappen did a few tweaks to his RB20 before Q3, which helped him get pole. And Horner said on Max's laps of the grid, he was feeling quite comfortable in the car. So a comfortable Max in a dominant Red Bull usually means one outcome. But Ferrari were on it this weekend, front limited circuit. Like Las Vegas, Red Bull do struggle with those front tyres, taking a lot of punishment. And with Pirelli bringing their softer compounds, it was moved to a two-stop race. So I think it would have been really close between Sainz and Verstappen. And it's hard to kind of understand how hard Sainz was pushing because he was in a position where the McLarens couldn't match it, and he's able to manage his pace to be on the optimal strategy. So he was effectively kind of just controlling things and not really fighting anyone. If he had been asked to push, it would have been a different story potentially, but it would have been very, very close. I think Ferrari were Red Bull's equals in Australia.
Yeah, it's interesting you touched on Vegas there. I actually used that as an example. I was speaking with some of my friends in a group chat on a social media app, and I referenced Vegas as a point where Ferrari genuinely were challenging Red Bull, and I mean it was only because of the safety car intervention that Leclerc lost his opportunity to win there. I think he probably could have won that Vegas Grand Prix.
Both Horner and Vasseur touched on it as well in their post race media sessions. They were both asked about the balance of power, and they both touched on Las Vegas. So I think we're not the only ones that are kind of seeing the similarities there.
I think as well, it's quite exciting to see. I think it'd be good to see in Suzuka because how the pecking order plays out, because Ferrari have definitely been second best so far this season and sort of leading the chasing pack behind Red Bull. They look poised to be the team in the best position to maybe start clawing that gap back to Red Bull as well. I think just the sense of the organisation, what Fred Vasseur's built, the understanding they have of their new car, making it easier to drive, easier to extract performance. There's a real sort of optimism with the Maranello squad that because they've got a good base, that hopefully when they bolt upgrades on it, they'll be able to start clawing that gap. But talking about McLaren quickly, they obviously do well in Australia, even when they had the poorer iteration of the MCL 60 last year. They had a strong result in Australia in 2023. And then now we've got this stronger car. Lando Norris said that the reason they were able to challenge for the podium, obviously with DNFs and Perez struggling, that helped. But also Australia's kind to them. So he's kind of cautious about where McLaren will be in Suzuka. But obviously high-speed corners in Suzuka. McLaren are strong with high-speed corners. So I'm quite interested to see how McLaren perform compared to Ferrari, and obviously Ferrari compared to Red Bull. It's all of a sudden, I think all it takes is one race where there's a different winner. There's a bit of promise from other teams. That's all it takes really to sort of energize feelings or and bring about more exciting questions going into the next race.
Yeah, I think McLaren will be really encouraged by this performance. It's a circuit that they kind of a middle ground. They expect to go well at a venue like Suzuka, where there's a lot of high speed corners, and that's why they were strong last year once they bolted on those upgrades mid season. This is more of there's a high speed course, but it's also a medium speed track. So there's kind of you got that slow speed final section where Ferrari are really strong all weekend. But for McLaren to be pushing Ferrari on this circuit, I can't wait to see what the dynamic is in Suzuka, because Norris is a bit cautious. He suspects McLaren will go well at Suzuka, but he's also wary that Ferrari have improved in that area compared to last season. But Norris is usually quite downplaying McLaren's expectations. So I would not be surprised if we expect Max to win in Suzuka. I would not be at all surprised to see Norris replicate his P2 there last year. I think it'll be tough for McLaren to get a double podium. It kind of all depends on what form Sergio Perez is in, because he struggled a lot at Suzuka last year, and it also depends on how good Ferrari's high-speed performance is. Norris thinks that he could have split the Ferraris in Melbourne, which is, it's like the Red Bull Ferrari question that you put to me. It's tough to say because truck position was king with dirty air. We saw in the first stint, Leclerc didn't even mount an attack on Norris, either because of the dirty air or because he didn't want to damage his tyres. It was that kind of fine line. It was a strange one that McLaren pitted Piastri. They all kind of reacted to Russell and Hamilton, who were pitted behind, and sellers explained that their aim was to try and get Piastri ahead of Leclerc, and then obviously Ferrari must have responded to that movement in the pit lane. If Ferrari hadn't have pitted and Piastri got ahead of Leclerc, then we'd be commending what a great strategy it was, because it ultimately would have been Piastri ahead of Norris ahead of Leclerc, and then McLaren would have just switched their drivers around and they'd be on for a double podium. But it didn't work out like that. Ferrari, I thought, were exceptional on the strategy. The fact that the Ferrari of old, they might have allowed McLaren to then undercut Leclerc at the second stop, but they were proactive on that and got it covered, and they got the 1-2. And we have seen it a few times from McLaren. They are a bit cautious, and I think that's a result of them still adapting to being a top team again. They're not used to that, running at the front, whereas Ferrari, although they've been, struggling the last few years and not really optimizing their potential, they've still been a team capable of landing podiums and the occasional win.
Yeah, I think that's interesting thing you say about mentality of being a top team of McLaren. I think there is definitely that sort of like that middle team mentality that sometimes can creep in where you don't maybe make ruthless decisions or high risk decisions because you don't want to like lose a chunk of points or whatever it may be. And with Ferrari, yeah, it's a different feeling, isn't it? There was no sort of "we are checking" comments coming over the radio. It only went down to, I think, Plan A and Plan B was the only ones that they flitted between on the Sainz radio. We didn't get to Plan C, D, or E. They were just, it was a well oiled machine. I mean, I'll quickly say, as a motorsport fan, and like Sebastian Vettel says, everybody's a Ferrari fan. There's a feeling you get, isn't there, when there's two scarlet red Formula One cars going across the start finish line 1 and 2. It does. I think especially for me, I started watching Formula One in the early 2000s, and that's what you saw quite a lot. So I don't know. There's a lot of nostalgia for a lot of people, I imagine, when that happens. But quickly as well, I want to touch on Sainz again. Obviously, he's losing his drive at Ferrari at the end of the year. He couldn't have done a better job of putting himself in the shop window for other teams. And there's going to be, I guess, a queue probably of teams maybe trying to get his signature. And who do you think those teams will be?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. Sainz could have done any more. He got 2 races, 2 podiums, and he's also taken the only 2 non-Red Bull wins in the last however many races, 20 plus races since the start of last season. So he's doing all. I think I've seen a lot of comparisons online, and Sainz has won 2 races in the last 2 seasons. Leclerc hasn't won 1. But I don't think that's the barometer by which you should judge the 2 Ferrari drivers on, because at the end of the day, before Australia, Leclerc was on a run of 7 consecutive front row starts. If he had been in a situation where in those races it had been Max blowing up, he would have won. And then all of a sudden the conversation is different. You know what I mean? If Verstappen had stayed in this Australian race and won it, Sainz would have been heralded for his comeback from his operation, but it wouldn't be getting anywhere near the hysteria that it is for him winning. So yeah, I don't think it's a fair comparison to do it. Oh, one driver's won so many races, the other one's won so many. I think you need to look at it over the course of the seasons, and Leclerc has been the stronger Ferrari driver. But that's nothing against Sainz, because Leclerc is an extraordinarily quick driver on his day, which is quite often. And Sainz has been near enough matching him. There's never much between them when they're both on top form. And considering Sainz came into Leclerc's team, Leclerc had displaced a 4-time champion, let's not forget, and has been near enough his equal. Sainz deserves a top seat. He shouldn't be a driver that's going to a project like the Sauber Audi one and longing it out and hoping in a few years' time that his work he gets delivered a car that's reflective of the work he's put in. He's ready to win races now. He's shown it in Singapore and Australia. He's ready to take those, and he said that in the press conference. He's ready to take those opportunities, and he's ready to win multiple races. And there are seats available that could grant him that, especially with the 2026 regulations incoming. You've got to look at Mercedes. Toto Wolff has his pipe dream of luring Verstappen away, but why would Verstappen move to Mercedes in their current predicament? He, instead of wasting time looking at what's going to happen with Max, I think he should be at the front of the queue trying to land Sainz, because a Sainz-Russell partnership would be very strong. On the other hand, Red Bull have a seat available. With the grid getting closer and Perez's inconsistency, you'd imagine Sainz would be closer to Verstappen more consistently than Perez is. But you've also got that dynamic where Verstappen and Sainz were teammates at Toro Rosso in their debut season. There was a bit of tension there. Would Red Bull want to go back to that? Horner did kind of leave it open when he was asked yesterday, but I don't think, I'd be surprised if Red Bull opted for a Verstappen Sainz lineup. I think their preference is is Perez. But if Perez isn't performing, if Ricciardo isn't performing and Tsunoda's kind of out of favour for a Red Bull promotion, then Sainz is the best bet on the market. And you've also got Aston Martin to take into the equation. We don't know what's going to happen with Alonso. Will Alonso opt to go for that Mercedes seat? Will he remain in Formula One? Who knows? But I think, as your midterm option, there's no one better on the market than Carlos Sainz, and I think Aston Martin would be wise to, have a look at that, regardless of whether it's to replace Alonso or potentially replace Stroll. If Aston Martin are serious on their ambitions of becoming a championship winning outfit, they're going to need two strong drivers in that lineup. And Stroll, he had a solid weekend, but nothing spectacular. And we've seen with him, consistency is the main issue. And Sainz, there's no one better to fill that role.
Yeah, I kind of feel sorry for Sainz in a way because he's leaving Ferrari just as they look to be getting to this almost approaching the top of this sort of curve of really turning things around and becoming a consistent threat. Obviously, Lewis Hamilton's taking the seat, and we'll get onto that later. Sort of what Lewis Hamilton's mindset is currently in Formula One, but out of those options, Red Bull, I think, I agree. He would definitely do a much better job than Perez. I think, obviously, they're different drivers now than him and Verstappen than they were when they were in that rookie season in Toro Rosso. So I think they're both very mature, and it would be a different scenario. And I think you'd see Sainz picking up a few more wins every year. It would probably be probably even better than Bottas was at his best at Mercedes. I think you could see Sainz having a lot more times on the top step, certainly more than Perez. It'd be interesting what the dynamic there would be. I mean, it would make Sainz's 2025 season incredible, and then 2026 might be an unknown of what with the Red Bull Powertrains project. Nobody really knows, obviously, how that's going to play out until it does. Mercedes is an interesting one because obviously Mercedes are in a really they're in a sticky wicket, shall we say? I think we'll get onto that in a bit more detail. So that would essentially be sort of a sacrifice because it looks like Mercedes are going to close out this regulation cycle with 2 poor seasons, unless there's a remarkable turnaround between now and sort of throughout 2025 as well. But Mercedes are quietly confident that their new 2026 engine will do the business for them, like the engine change in 2014 obviously elevated them to great success. I honestly think Aston Martin is probably the best landing spot for Sainz if it comes about. I really like the way that team has sort of fashioned itself into a challenger. Obviously, they're sort of towards the back of that chasing pack in the top teams, but the future, I think, for them looks good. They've got good personnel in that team. I think Mike Crack as a team principal is sort of he's confident team principal. I like the way he leads the team. Obviously, they've got people like Dan Fallows there as well. They've got the new facilities for the new systems that comes with new facilities. They've got the Honda engine deal coming in 2026. So there'll be a works team. And I think that's really important for them to be able to step out of Mercedes' shadow. They're not going to be relying on using the Mercedes wind tunnel, the Mercedes engine, the Mercedes gearbox, and obviously the rear suspension and everything that comes with that. I think that would be a great opportunity for him if Alonso moves aside to either another team or steps away from the sport, because honestly, I don't see Lance Stroll leaving it for the time being. So that would be where I'd put Sainz. I think that would be the best spot for him. That was a long rant from me, but Sainz to Aston Martin would be my dream scenario for the Spaniard.
I agree with you on that. I think that's the move that would make sense for both Sainz and Aston Martin. I think it's a partnership that on paper is just an absolute dream. And if Aston Martin, as you say, for all those reasons, if they can hit 2026, if they can hit the ground running in 2026, there'll be no more capable driver than Sainz. He's coming into the peak of his career now in his early 30s.
Should we touch on Aston Martin's race a little bit? I think they finished 7th. No, it was 6th and 8th in the end, wasn't it? I'm trying to think because obviously there was the penalty.
Yes, I'm sure that's a big talking point.
Yep, we can get onto that. Essentially, Aston Martin, I think they relied on strategy calls. They relied on the misfortune of others with DNFs, what have you. Because Alonso, I think, basically came to the assessment that the race pace wasn't there, but they made good strategy calls. Alonso finished on the road in 6th place, having had to defend in the final few laps against George Russell in the Mercedes. And Lance Stroll was in 8th place on the road as this was playing out. And then for those who don't know, going into turn 6 on the final lap, Alonso tried to employ a defensive driving manoeuvre where he basically backed off a little bit more to then get a clean exit out of the corner ahead of the DRS zone so that he could have enough of a gap so that the DRS wouldn't allow Russell to pass. Unfortunately for Alonso, he kind of made an error in judgment with how much he needed to slow. He sort of slowed down quite dramatically, sped up a bit, and then had to slow it down again to make the corner. Meanwhile, George Russell behind was caught off guard by Alonso slowing down earlier than he would have done usually. Lost control, obviously went off into the gravel, hit the wall on the outside of turn 6. His car, ended up on its side, and we had that VSC to end the race. So Russell was out, and then they got called to the stewards, and after an hour-long discussion, Alonso was given the equivalent of a drive-through penalty of 20 seconds. So that demoted Alonso to 8th. It promoted Stroll to 6th. So still a good, decent points haul for Aston Martin. But the penalty, do you think it was the right decision?
It's been one of the most contentious decisions in quite a while. And mainly because it's a bit of a grey area. It wasn't a clear-cut incident where you've had two drivers clashing. It was one where a driver behind had an incident, but they were investigating the actions that influenced that. And initially, when I heard about it, also you saw it live and you heard about it, and you see the interviews from Russell and Toto and Andrew Shovlin, I still thought it would get thrown out. It was one of those ones where they'd investigate it, and then it's kind of just dropped. Not much is made of it. But then when you realise that they'd been in the stewards for an hour, you realise there was more to it. And having seen both the onboards for the lap before and the last lap, and the telemetry, I'm of the opinion Alonso's not got a leg to stand on. As you said, I think he's misjudged it. And that is that's very unlike Fernando Alonso. He's usually very crafty, the master of these things. I mean, look at Abu Dhabi last year. He did effectively something similar against Lewis Hamilton when they were playing DRS chicken, and he got away with that. This one, as I said, I think he's misjudged it. He's slowed down way too much and shifted down a gear to get away with saying, oh, he'd had some issues, he was managing battery issues, whatnot. Russell's made the mistake, there's no doubt in that, but Alonso has contributed in a way. But I do think the wording was a bit, when you look at the steward's verdict, it doesn't read like an FIA report, if you know what I mean. It's not got that professional. It felt like someone on Twitter had posted that, and I think I can see the argument that it does set a precedent going forward, because the wording was potentially dangerous. They weren't saying flat out it was dangerous, potentially dangerous. So what do we constitute as potentially dangerous? On past incidents, would we have said Perez holding up Hamilton in Abu Dhabi 2021 and slowing the Mercedes to help Verstappen in that title battle? Was that potentially dangerous? Should that have been penalised with this new rule? It does leave a lot to be desired, and I think going forward there's going to be a lot of incidents of a similar nature where drivers are playing different tactics to keep their position, and they're going to be saying, hang on a second, Fernando was penalised in Australia, where's the penalty for this? So yeah, I think Alonso has misjudged it. I think it was a penalty. 20 seconds, quite harsh, but if it is deemed dangerous driving, then you've got to give the maximum penalty out. But I think going forward, there's going to be some confusion over what is dangerous driving and what isn't.
It wouldn't be the first time that the FIA stewards have basically opened up Pandora's box when it comes to interpreting regulations. So I'm sure it's going to be fun to monitor those situations if they play out again. I think the key thing with the Alonso thing is the fact that the telemetry and everything, and it mentioned how he sped up, and then slowed again because he'd slowed too much in the first instance. I mean, that was the key thing. If he'd have managed to do it a bit smoother, just slowed a bit more than usual, then powered through the corner, and we wouldn't have had these problems. There was also some confusion on social media regarding the employment of a virtual safety car, which I think have both sort of irked us somewhat. Obviously, Russell at the end there, he was on the side in his car in the middle of the track. His team radio, he was panicking and calling for a red flag. They deployed a virtual safety car, and a lot of people said that this was, it was just, a miscue from the FIA. It should have been a red flag, blah, 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 blah. But I think obviously what you've got to consider is that cars slow down to the same delta for a VSC as they do for a red flag. Nobody stops on track in a red flag, apart from the person that's caused it, obviously. There was quite a fair distance between Russell and the next car. Drivers are informed on steering wheels what's happening. Radio engineers are informing drivers what's happening, and it is a manageable situation, especially especially in that situation, it was a manageable situation. Would you agree with my assessment there?
Yeah, I'm on the totally the same page as you. As you say, with a red flag and a VSC, you've got drivers who are still circulating going to the same delta time. So, say for example, you had a car that was a few car lengths back from Russell and was blinded as he came out of turn 6. Red flag, virtual safety car wouldn't make a difference. You'd still be going the same speed. I'm in no doubt the FIA would have looked at this track map, seen there was like an 11-second gap between Russell and the next car along, and made their decision. I understand why there's complaints because Russell was in a dangerous position, but I think it's something of nothing. The FIA, they don't always get these things spot on, but in this case, they couldn't have done anything differently. They responded, whereas sometimes there's complaints that they're not proactive. They let things develop. Like, obviously, it wasn't a dangerous incident, but take in Saudi Arabian qualifying, the red flag for Hulkenberg's stricken car. That took quite a few minutes for the red flag to come out when it was clear Hulkenberg's car wasn't going anywhere, and it was in a position on the track where if someone had gone off, they could have gone straight into it. Whereas here, they were straight on it, and the virtual safety car was out. So I think they did everything they should have done, and the uproar was just a bit unnecessary, really. I think it's more of a reaction based on past incidences and Russell's frantic team radio.
Yes. And then from uproar for sort of decisions like that, I think there could potentially be uproar in the Mercedes camp because it was a dismal weekend for them, really. Hamilton obviously had his DNF early on with the engine failure. But Russell had a DNF, obviously not really through his own making or partially through his own making. But even so, Mercedes looked comfortably the fifth best team in my view. Really sort of worrying times for them. Hamilton himself, post-race, was still quite upbeat, remarkably, despite it being basically a terrible weekend. So you kind of get the feeling from him that his mind's already sort of set on Maranello. He's looking at the Ferraris doing really well and thinking, great, I'm quite happy about where I'm going to be next year, because Mercedes just seem to just have no idea really where they're going. I mean, obviously there's these correlation issues with simulator and on-track results, which is alarming to say the least. A change of car concept that should have hopefully have given them a more drivable base, a better base to bolt upgrades onto, like Ferrari have had success with, but it's just not happening for them. And obviously you wrote on motorsportweek.com, Taylor, how Toto Wolff's sort of assessment of the situation, maybe he's missing the fact that in his assessment, he thinks the team isn't missing something. What are your thoughts on sort of the Mercedes situation and Wolff's assessment of it?
I said it after our Saudi Arabian Grand Prix podcast that at some point it's going to look like Mercedes aren't on a decline. It's just that's where they're at. And I'm going to keep repeating that rhetoric throughout this season because they are the fifth fastest team at the moment. And just compare where Ferrari and Mercedes are at. They both overhauled their car concepts. You've got one that has a really strong base, could have challenged Red Bull on pure pace this weekend and delivered a 1-2 maximum points. Got 44 points from this weekend, whereas you've got Mercedes after 3 rounds, 26 points. So Ferrari have outscored Mercedes within 1 round. The car, they just don't understand the car. The fact that they've they've got rid of all these, spiteful rear end tendencies that its predecessor had. But now they've got a car where they don't understand if it's going to be strong or if it's going to be weak. I mean, look at the Australia weekend as a whole. It's not just the fact they're going. You get some teams who go to one track and they admit they're not going to, the track characteristics aren't going to suit their car, but then another track might suit their car. Mercedes in FP1 it looked okay. FP2 they tried some really aggressive setups on Hamilton's car which backfired, and then get into FP3 and Hamilton was fourth, less than a tenth off the quickest time, and Russell was fifth. They were both saying the car's much better in the morning. Got to qualify, Hamilton's out in Q2 at 11th and doesn't understand why the car's the way it is, and then it was the same in the race. They had no pace to challenge the cars ahead of them. But then towards the end, as Toto Wolff said, they are actually showing some, decent lap times for Russell to catch the Aston Martin. It's a messy situation. When you've got correlation issues, I think that's the worst thing you can have as a team, because you can't bring upgrades in the knowledge that they're going to work as expected. So they're kind of stuck in this predicament while other teams will be bringing upgrades and developing, which kind of, creates a bigger chasm than they've already got.
I mean, I don't even have a huge amount of faith in a new rule cycle is going to help them, because it's not going to be. I mean, the chassis and the sort of aerodynamic regulation stuff like that is still being sort of developed, so we're not really sure what those are going to be completely. But I don't think they're going to be radically different from what we're seeing now. But regardless, if you're having correlation issues and the fact that they're not going to be able to start developing 2026 cars until next year, so that's a short time frame, I think they could struggle even to nail the next set of regulations if they're having correlation problems, which is what sort of set off their problems from 2022 to now. So yeah, not looking good for Mercedes, but things were looking good for a number of the smaller teams on the grid in Australia. Obviously, Alonso's penalty and then DNFs for Hamilton and Verstappen, it meant that there were some spaces open in the top 10 for some of the smaller teams to capitalise on. Yuki Tsunoda in the RB capitalised really well to pick up some points in 7th, which has elevated them to 6th in the Constructors, which is a really good result for them. And Tsunoda, I think, had a really good weekend. And there was also a double points finish for Haas, which is a remarkable thing to think about, really. It's been a long time since that happened. And I think what's even more extraordinary with Haas's result in 9th and 10th is that it came after a poor qualifying session, and they translated that into a well-executed race to pick up those 3 points. And Aya Komatsu, the new team principal, was just jubilant and so delighted with it in his sort of post-race interviews, be it with the likes of Ted Kravitz or otherwise. And it was really good to see them execute a good race. And it really looks like they're turning a corner with the issues they had, obviously, with race pace last year. What did you make of the likes of Tsunoda and obviously Haas's heroics?
Tsunoda's weekend, he's one of the drivers of the weekend without doubt. Second Q3 appearance of the season, he beat Stroll and Alonso to 8th place. In qualifying, wasn't able to keep them behind, but he profited from Alonso's penalty and the 3 front-running retirements of Verstappen, Hamilton and Russell. Helmut Marko had said in the run-up to the race that Tsunoda had been impressing, but both him and Ricciardo's race pace was too slow, and kind of criticising that they hadn't got any points. There was no more emphatic answer than what Tsunoda put in. He was only a few seconds off Stroll at the end, put Ricciardo in the shade, and we might as well touch on Ricciardo now, because he kind of, batted away some criticism heading into the race from Alan Jones and other people, and seemed really upbeat. And he's admitted he thought this would be the weekend on home soil that would kickstart his season, but he had a track time deleted in Q1 at the end by a lap time deleted at the end of Q1 for exceeding track limits at turn 4, I believe it was, which relegated him down the order he was at in Q1, which then kind of, made it a tall order for him. RB tried to do an aggressive strategy, start on the softs, and then pit on lap 5, but then everybody else kind of follows that, and so it mitigated the gains that he could make, and he trailed home outside the points. And I think the worrying thing for Ricciardo is that his deleted lap time was still a few tenths off Tsunoda, and he admitted the lap was quite good. He came over the line thinking, you know what, that's quite a good lap. And normally when that happens, you expect the performance to be there, but it just wasn't. So even when he obviously he had those problems in Saudi Arabia where there was something up with the car that they didn't fix. But he's come to Australia full of, enthusiasm for what he can achieve in front of his home fans. He's comfortable in the car, or more comfortable, and he's still not able to match Tsunoda. And he's been brought back into the Red Bull fold with the intention of getting back to that Red Bull seat that he vacated at the end of 2018. If he doesn't perform and end up getting that seat, then not only is it a bad for him, I think it's bad for the Red Bull operation in general, because effectively you've wasted a season that Liam Lawson could have had 24 races, to stake his claim for a Red Bull promotion. Getting on to Haas, I'm so happy for them, just because the criticism they took, and I probably partly, was responsible. I probably gave some of that criticism. When Andretti got rejected, all the calls were, oh, well, look at Haas saying they're going to start on the back foot this season. Why are we allowing Haas to, linger at the back and Andretti not be allowed entry into the sport? But Haas worked away. They had a really, subdued pre-season, focused on the long runs. And it's so refreshing that they've got, it's like Ferrari. We know now that even if they don't qualify spectacularly or as well as they have done in previous years, they've got a car they can fight with. They can move up the order because they've not got these tyre degradation concerns that they have had in recent seasons. And as you said, they had a poor qualified. I think Magnussen was 14th and Hulkenberg was out in Q1. So they weren't in good starting positions on a track that's hard to overtake. Yet they made the most of the strategy. They had Hulkenberg go long on the hard. He took advantage of the virtual safety car. And yeah, it was a nice reward for them that Russell's crash at the end gave Magnussen P10, just like it did in Singapore. And once again, Carlos Sainz was the winner for the third time when George Russell crashed on the last lap. So, bit of symmetry there. But yeah, delighted for Haas and Tsunoda. Really good weekends from those two teams and those drivers.
Yeah, I think with Haas, it's another one of those things you sort of install an engineer in sort of a new team principal in Ikematsu. It seems to be the method of putting an engineer as team principal, promoting from within, and it seems to do quite well. Obviously, with Andrea Stella at McLaren, you're getting proof in the pudding there as well. Yeah, very good for them. And obviously, they had their ruthless tactics in Saudi Arabia that got them points, and here they obviously executed really, really well. Also, again with Danny Rick, I think that I agree with you wholeheartedly. To be honest, it is looking concerning, and I think these sort of next two races at more conventional F1 circuits, Suzuka and Shanghai, they're vital now. I think the dream of going to the Red Bull seats, I think, honestly, even at this early stage, I think that's gone. I think it would take a remarkable turn of fortune for Red Bull to think that he's going to do a better job than Perez, and even Tsunoda, obviously, after Tsunoda did a very capable weekend. And I think Tsunoda couldn't have had a better weekend preparing for his home Grand Prix than the one he had in Australia. It's looking increasingly like Ricciardo's still in this mode where it's only the Mexico Grand Prix where he sort of gets a good result, which is obviously a long way away, and there could be even question marks whether he makes it that far, because, again, touching on Liam Lawson, and I agree with you emphatically, he's sort of missed out on a chance that he rightly deserved, I think, based on the results he put in last season. When he stood in for Ricciardo, he proved that he was capable of having a full-time drive, and he's missing out on that at the moment. There's a very real possibility with the way Red Bull run their setups and stuff like that, and the ruthless decisions they made. They made it with De Vries last year, that Ricciardo could effectively be replaced by Lawson before the season's over. I mean, obviously, we need to wait to see if that sort of thing will play out. But not looking good for the Australian. Williams, they missed out on being one of those smaller teams to be able to capitalise on points, and they made a ruthless decision of their own to try and do their best to claim points this weekend. Obviously, it all started with free practice one on Friday morning, with Alex Albon having that incident at turn 6, which in the end wrote off his FW46 chassis, which needed to be sent back to Grove to be fixed. And whilst they were deciding whether they were going to be able to repair the chassis in time for both cars to continue with the rest of the Grand Prix, the decision in the air was already lingering about what they would do if they only had one car. Would they pull Logan Sargeant out of the race and replace him with Alex Albon in the bid to try and chase points? And ultimately, that's what they did. And it ended up not panning out for them. I think Albon had a strong qualifying. He qualified in 12th, which put them on the fringe of being able to fight for points if DNFs and stuff like that occurred, which they did. But unfortunately, they weren't able to capitalise because the pace just wasn't there on Sunday. But the decision they made, obviously, to pull Sargeant out of the car when they realised that they could only compete with one chassis, it did appear quite harsh, I think. It was obviously logical because Alex Albon is leaps and bounds a better Grand Prix driver than Logan Sargeant is at this stage, and he would be the better driver to try and get you points. But still, there's a lot of question marks, isn't there, over Williams? Obviously, they had that difficult off-season and they had to be in the position to make that choice of not having spare chassis for the first few races, which is questionable in itself. And then again, if you're in this predicament and you feel that Logan Sargeant isn't a good enough or capable enough Grand Prix driver to put you in a good place on Sunday, it begs the question why you brought him on for a second season in Formula One if you don't think he has the ability to deliver. That's a really big that's the biggest thing in my mind. And also, it's going to be such a confidence knock for him. I mean, obviously they're saying he's a team player and all that, but he's got to prove now that he's good enough, because obviously I think the assessment from the team kind of feels like he isn't. But what do you make of the whole situation?
Yeah, it's one of those controversial decisions where if Williams had scored points, it would have been forgotten about and, held as a masterstroke. But because Albon came home 11th, just on the outskirts of the points, it's going to be talked about probably up until the Japanese Grand Prix, when Sargeant is asked questions on media day about how he feels. And he'll, say the rhetoric that he had to do it for the team and he was happy to do it, or not happy, but, prepared to do it. But he didn't really have a choice, because at the end of the day, the team make the call and he doesn't have a leg to stand on. From Williams' perspective, you can understand the decision, because when the midfield's so tight and you're scrapping for minor points, you've got to take every opportunity you can. And historically, there's enough evidence to state that Albon's a stronger driver than Sargeant. And Friday, things didn't look too bad for Williams. They looked like they had a decent, shot, an outside shot of capitalising on any chaos that went on. And indeed, on Sunday, it did go on. Except Williams weren't in a position to take advantage of that, because they had A, one car, and B, Albon's crash in FP1, which meant he missed FP2, meant Williams didn't have enough long run data to fall back on, and they kind of went to a vicious cycle of tyre graining, which, although through undercut strategy they were able to fight against the Haas cars, Albon was powerless to keep both Hulkenberg and Magnussen at bay, so he finished 11th rather than 9th or 10th, which could have been on the table on another day. I think you can understand it from Williams' perspective, but Sargeant, I don't see how I think this is the final nail in the coffin. I don't see how he recovers from this, because he's a driver that was low on confidence anyway. And, Williams and James Vowell spoke a lot about, building his confidence up. This is just going to knock all that progress back, because it's the biggest no-vote confidence you could have in somebody to hook them from a Grand Prix at the expense of your teammate. And if he starts making mistakes again, look at Suzuka last year, he, wrote the car off in qualifying. All it takes is him to do that again, and he's going to be at rock bottom, and it's going to be a cycle where he can't get out of it. I think Williams kept him on because it was convenient. When the field's so tight now and it takes so long for a driver to get up to speed because they only have 1.5 days in the car before the first Grand Prix, they saw it as, okay, we've had Sargeant, we've invested in his career, even prior to F1, we've now invested 22 race F1 season into him, we might as well give him that second season to build on. But yeah, I don't see how, he hasn't started the season great, and now he's had this, I just don't see how he pushes on and earns a third season. So I agree with you. I think there was no point keeping him on if this is a situation you're going to get into where you can't rely on him when his is the only chassis available.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a long old season now for Sargent. Bless him. It's definitely a vote of no confidence. And like you say, convenient keeping him on. I think there was a lack of a better option available to Williams really going into 2024. I think many people from the outside could have been like, "I'll give Liam Lawson a drive," but that would mean sort of extracting him from his deal with Red Bull, which I guess that sort of mechanism maybe wasn't sort of available. If I were Williams, and I know obviously before preseason testing, James Vowles said that we've got our own academy drivers, yada yada yada, when asked about Kimi Antonelli, but I don't think that any of the Williams academy drivers are really ready to make that step up. Whereas I think a season of Formula 2, obviously Kimi Antonelli's seen as this hot shot. Now in sort of testing of previous cars, you can use ground effect cars. If I were Mercedes and Williams, I'd be getting Andrea Kimi Antonelli not just in a 2022 Mercedes doing testing runs, but I'd get him in a 2022 Williams, which wasn't an awful car in its sort of updated iteration. I'd be doing testing mileage in that and getting him ready for the next season. To be honest, to join Albon, that would be the decision I'd make. Anyway, moving on. Two teams remaining to chat about, and both having sort of enduring their difficulties. Alpine didn't have a great day at the office once again. I think Gasly and Ocon were in the tail end of things. It was Gasly got that penalty, wasn't it, for crossing the pit lane exit white line?
Yeah, he did it once in qualifying, got a reprimand, and did it again in the race. So he obviously didn't take the warning, but didn't really influence his race too much.
I mean, yeah, they were never going to go score points, and Ocon was just sort of in obscurity as well, wasn't he?
Well, Ocon could have scored. I think I'm right in saying that he had we had Perez and a visor tear off, got lodged in his floor or underneath his floor. I think Ocon had one. It might have been lodged in his brake, so we had to make a pit stop, which obviously with track position so vital. And both Alpine drivers said it in Saudi Arabia, when Ocon was in that kind of train battling, he wasn't battling on pace, he was battling because he was there at the right time. So for Alpine, it's a case of until upgrades arrive, kind of being in position rather than placing themselves in a position, if you know what I mean, more circumstance than genuine pace. But yeah, when you got that conspiring against you, you've not got much hope.
No, and I think talking about conspiring against you, Sauber seem to be conspiring against themselves. They're struggling with pace with their car, but they're also struggling to get the wheels off the thing when they come into the pits. Bottas had his botched stop in Bahrain, and then it was Zhou's turn in Saudi Arabia, and I think they both had a go this weekend, which just relegated them to the back of the field even further than it would have done otherwise. It's really, I mean, they're not looking like a well-oiled machine. They could definitely be maybe trying to loosen up those wheel nuts, because crikey, it seems to be a sticky situation, if you pardon my pun. But things, again, not looking good for them.
Yeah, I mean, it speaks volumes that when they had, I think it was on Zhou's car, when I think he was the first one to have the problem in Melbourne. I thought when the mechanics weren't around his car, they were kind of a bit more withdrawn. I presume they were retiring their car. But yeah, it turns out that it was another wheel gun issue, which, considering after Saudi Arabia, they said they'd invested a lot of time and resource in making sure it didn't happen again. So have it happen on both cars. Yeah, it's not good for them. I mean, Bottas getting a 3.8 second stop was kind of heralded as a miracle. And that's, in modern day F1 terms, that's not quick by any stretch when you've got teams, doing borderline 2 seconds or in some instances below 2 seconds. And yeah, I mean, it was a shame for Bottas because on his technical home Grand Prix, he lives in Australia, so he's kind of been adopted as a native Australian along with Piastri and Ricciardo. He had actually a good weekend. He got through to Q2, the first time Sauber have got into Q2 this season. He put his car 14th, and I mean, considering he was kind of around the Magnussen-Hulkenberg area, if he had track position, we don't really know what Sauber's race pace is like, because they're in a gaggle of cars at the start of a race, and then they have these 30-second plus pit stops, and they're literally relegated to the back. So we've got No idea where Sauber stand because they keep shooting themselves in the foot.
Yes, I think when Audi do their takeover, they should buy some new wheel guns. I think that probably be their list of priorities, which is a
Growing list.
growing list. Yeah, it's not really what you want to be thinking about when you're preparing to take over a Formula One team. It's like, right, well, we're going to have to fix the half-a-minute pit stops, but
Considering Sauber are, an established name in F1, and the Himwheel-based squad have been, kind of a cornerstone of F1 for a while now, you'd hope the fundamentals wouldn't be something that would be a teeth in trouble. But there we go. Audi have a lot of work to, haul that team up the order, it seems.
right, yes, definitely. I'd say that would be a good place to end. I think we've covered our 10 Formula One teams and their exploits, positive or otherwise, at the Australian Grand Prix. So I guess it's left for me now to do our closing link of spiel and calls to action for our lovely listeners. So, Taylor, thank you for joining me. Listeners, thank you for joining us. That brings an end to our podcast of Motorsport Speak. And make sure you like, subscribe, review on any of the podcast platforms you like to use. Make sure you go on motorsportweek.com and check out all the latest motorsport news and features and exclusive interviews that we write. Also check out Motorsport Monday, our free digital magazine, out every Monday. You can get emailed straight to your inbox if you subscribe. That's at motorsportmonday.com. And also follow us on all the social media channels at Motorsport Week on X, formerly known as Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, TikTok. I think that's all of them. You can also follow us on LinkedIn if you enjoy a more business-like social media experience. But that's all from me and all from Taylor. Goodbye.
Bada bing, bada boo.